Hello my friends, and welcome to the second episode of the Scratch Art Animal series. Today we are going to be practicing some of the value techniques that we learned in episode 1. So if you haven't completed this step and you don't know how to do all of these different value techniques, I would recommend going back to episode 1 and just making sure you understand these concepts before moving on. Because today we are taking these same value scales, but we're creating them on Scratchboard. It is a pretty big switch to go from shading in the darker side of the value scale to shading in the lighter side of the value scale. So the difference with this Scratchboard is that we are working on adding the white, not the black. So we're going to go through and I'll show you all of the steps to complete all of these value scales and the two spheres underneath. And remember that this is just a practice that's building up to being able to complete that final project of designing an animal and creating it on Scratchboard. So this is going to help you create a more successful project in the end. So let's get started. To transfer your value scales and those spheres onto your paper, you just need to color the entire back of that value scale page with pencil. Then you're going to lay it down on top of your Scratchboard, and you're going to add just a small piece of tape so that the paper doesn't move around, and you need to make sure that it's taped onto the table, your value scale page, and your Scratchboard. Once you've done that, you can use a ruler and any utensil, whether it's a pencil or pen, it doesn't matter. We're just worried about the amount of pressure that we're using when we're drawing along these edges. Because the pencil is filled in on the back of this piece of paper, as we apply pressure on top, it's actually transferring each of these lines onto that paper underneath it so that it's all set up and ready for us to fill in, and it'll make it much faster and easier for us in the long run. Make sure you trace over every single line for all of these value scales, for the spheres, and for their shadows. You can lift your paper up to check and see if you're missing any lines, and you should have pencil outlines of all of these spaces. To get started working on the value scales, it's really important to just take the time to make that shift mentally and remember that you are working on adding the white now instead of the darker value. So we're starting on the other end, and the steps are very similar. So we're going to block out that whole section of white just the same way that we blocked out that square section of black when we were working on the value scales in a traditional way. I would also like for you to practice outlining things, which doesn't sound like it's very difficult, but as you can see, with Scratchboard, it is sometimes tricky to make a straight line. So that's a great reason to practice it as you're creating your value scales. The first value scale we're practicing is hatching, just like the one that we practiced first on our original value scale practice. So we're going to go through and fill this in, and something that you should know about working with our scratching tool is that it has a very sharp end. And so sometimes when you're trying to remove enough of the black film to have all of that white show through, it sometimes catches on that white part of the background of the paper. So sometimes when that happens, it'll get stuck because it's so sharp, and it'll actually tear a little bit of that white background. So as you're filling this in, I really want you practicing using a little bit more of the side of your scratching tool rather than just the very end point. So now we're going to go back through and just sharpen up some of the outside edges, and we're actually going to start filling in some of those medium tone lines. So again, we're still working with vertical lines, and we're controlling the value by thinking about how much space is in between the lines we're working with. So if we want to have it look like it's very light in this case, then we would have all of our lines really close together, which is actually the opposite of what you were practicing before. It's the same concept, just reversed with the values. Students should know that adding layers is the best way to work with scratch art, and it's really easy to try and get it done all at once and to try and have it be a smooth transition, but this medium is just something that requires you to go back and forth quite often to make sure that it's smooth. Something else that you need to make sure you're doing is using your hand to just dust away some of the crumbs to see what is left, because sometimes that little black film will make crumbs over the top, and it looks like it's still black, but it's actually already been scratched away. It's just the little crumbs that are resting right there. So it's really important that you continue to clean off your drawing as you're working. Your goal here is to make sure that you're creating a smooth transition from value to value. So if you can see a section where you can say, oh, that's a different value than this one, and there's not a transition between them, that's where you need to go back through and add another layer. As you're working, you really need to be looking at your drawing and thinking, okay, where are the thickest sections that I'm trying to fill in right now? And you really have to use a lot of hand-eye coordination to get the point of that little scratching tool right into that space that you're trying to fill. It's also really important that you go all the way up against the edges for this, because a big mistake that students often make is that they'll fill in the value and it's filling the middle of their value scale, but not the edges of your value scale. This is an excellent chance for you to practice working inside of the lines and having controlled movements for when you're working on your animal in the future. So this is an excellent chance for you to practice these skills, and I do expect that your value scales have smooth transitions and are very neat. So they're filling the entire space and going all the way up to the edges and not outside the lines. At this point, I was working on just filling in as much of that lighter end as I could, making it a nice smooth transition. But as I got closer to the middle, I really started needing to think about spacing out my lines just a little bit more, because we wanted to start transitioning into that dark value. So that means that I was pressing lighter with my scratching tool, so I wasn't pressing very hard, because sometimes you do get thicker lines that way. So I was pressing very lightly to get thin lines to make it look a little darker, and I was spacing out my lines a little bit more to help it have a smooth transition. Something that's helpful for me when I'm completing activities like this, where I'm trying to have a nice smooth transition with my values, I'll actually squint my eyes and just sort of blur my vision a little bit while I'm looking at my value scales, and that really is helpful to me because I can kind of tell where it needs to be a little bit smoother, where it's a little bit too dark, where it might be a little too light, so I can just choose to go back and fix those areas. Something to keep in mind while you're working on this is that you're able to continue adding white to this project, but you are not able to go back and add black. So it's much better to start off a little darker than you think you're going to need, and then slowly build up your white value. When you're working on the darker end of your value scale, it's perfectly all right if you just barely graze the top of that black film so that you're removing smaller amounts. It's even all right if your lines don't reach the top and the bottom. They can just be shorter little lines, and that's perfectly fine. And this is what it should look like. For the second value scale, you're going to start exactly the same way that we did for our last one, and then you're going to overlap with some diagonal lines. So we're starting on the end that's closer to the right to fill in all of our white space, and as we're going, just make sure that you are continuing to fill in all the way up against the edges. Now, the way that we're going to change the value here is actually by spacing out our lines. So when we're working on the right-hand side, your lines can be pretty close together, but as we continue to move towards the center of the value scale, you want to make sure that your lines are slowly starting to space apart, and I would also recommend pressing lighter with your scratch tool so that your lines end up thinner. As you start to reach the side on the left where it's supposed to be getting darker, your lines don't even have to be full length lines. You can use some little shorties in there just to kind of make it look like it's getting darker in value. Once you've added that first layer going all the way across your value scale, you're going to go back and add a second layer. So what we're looking for when we're adding the second layer are the areas that didn't get filled in and it's left a little gap. And if you squint your eyes, it leaves a dark space. So we're using our scratching tool to go through and fill in any of those awkward gaps that we might have to make it a smoother transition. Unfortunately, my camera skipped the first part of this value scale, but you'll complete it the same way that you did when you were working on the stipple technique for your original value scales in pencil. So we're working with small scribble techniques first. So we're just making a bunch of really teeny little small circles, and I'm working to fill in this area so that I don't have any awkward patches of dark. Once you've reached about halfway through on your value scale, that's when you're going to switch to using just little dots instead of working with those circular motions like we did for the scribble. So we're trying to fill this in so that it's nice and smooth and even, and we're going to continue adding those dots and spacing them farther and farther apart to show that it's getting darker in value. Once you reach the left side of the value scale, you're really just wanting to make these very, very small little marks. What you want to avoid is having any big dashes or going so fast that you create the little Nike swoosh symbol rather than just a little dot. So we're trying to fill these in so that they have an even amount of space around all of the dots so that it's just a nice smooth transition. And as you start to get closer and closer to that dark end, you want to make sure that your dots are spaced out. Once you've filled in your value scale with that first layer, that's when you need to go back through and continue adding more layers so that you make sure that it's a smooth transition in every place possible in this value scale, including up against the edges of your value scale. Our next value scale is the Scribble value scale. So again, we're starting by filling it in completely solid on that right-hand side with white, and we're using small circular motions to fill in the area right up against that space. As you're filling in the right-hand side, so the lighter side of this value scale, make sure that your circles are consistent in size and that they have a variety of ways that they overlap each other. You don't want to make a bunch of columns with these circular motions because it will fill in certain areas with just solid white. When you're working in the middle section of this value scale, you're slowly increasing the size of your circles and you're spacing them apart just a little bit more. So as you're working, you really need to pay attention to how much black do you have left and making sure that you have more and more left over as you work towards the left side of this value scale. As you fill in the left side, you can really just make some very small curved lines, and that's just enough. You don't need to fill this in very much because this is the darker side of the value scale, and we want to make sure that it is a nice smooth transition into that dark value. Next, you're going to go back over the top of your value scale and add that second layer so that you don't have any areas that you accidentally skipped. And when you're finished, it should look something like this. We're going to begin this last value scale in a similar way, but just a tiny bit different. Instead of making this a perfectly straight-edged box, we want to have sort of a zigzag edge on the side so that we can transition from that light to a more medium tone a little bit easier. If we had a perfect solid edge on the side of that box, then it would be really difficult to disguise that line with overlapping with other lines. So it is really important that we make sure that the way that these value sections end is sort of a zigzaggy shape. We don't want to have these sections making columns or areas where it's filled in a straight up and down section. If that happens, sometimes the lines will overlap each other too much in that space where the columns overlap, and then you end up with these white stripes in between your sections of value. So we're trying to make sure that it's just a nice smooth zigzag edge along each of these sections of value. So you can sort of fill it in thinking dark, medium, light. So on this side where we're filling in the right, I'm just going through and making sure that these lines are fairly close together. And then as we work towards the middle, I'm just slowly starting to space them apart from each other. I also think it's beneficial to work with shorter lines compared to longer lines. So as you're working, you should just be able to move your scratching tool back and forth, and all you're thinking about is how much black space do I have in between these lines. And you want to make sure it's a smooth transition, so you're trying to slowly space them out more and more as you work your way towards the left. Once you've got the majority of that value scale filled in, you can go back over with another layer and start adjusting to help it have a smoother transition. So you're looking for any areas where it goes from one value suddenly to another, and you want to just add another layer in between those two layers so that it helps it transition from one to the other a little bit smoother. And this is what it should look like after you've added those last few layers, making sure that you have smooth transitions between each value. The first step to filling in your stipple sphere is to first sketch out those two crescent moon shapes and that circle highlight. And you can do that with either a pencil or very small little marks with your scratch tool. You'll begin by creating that highlight that's just off to the side, and you want to fill that in solid white. So the best way to do that is using the side of your scratch tool rather than the point, because you don't want to end up tearing that white background. From there, you're slowly going to start spacing out some small, teeny tiny circles so that you don't actually see those lines showing up. You just want to imply that there's small little black spots showing through. As you continue, you're going to slowly start spacing out those circles just a little bit more. And it is really easy for you to accidentally show too many lines with this technique, so I would really recommend focusing on keeping these just so small as you're drawing these circles. You want to have your medium tone start fading as you get closer to the edge of that first crescent moon that you were drawing. Once you've filled in most of your medium tone, that's when you're going to switch to working with just dots. So we're just taking that tip of the scratching tool and just tapping it down onto that black film to remove small little bits of it. We don't want to have big giant spots or circles or anything drawn in. This should be as small and smooth as possible. As you're working your way out, you really just want to make sure that you're using teeny tiny little dots and starting to slowly space them out more and more. This is actually quite a long process, and stippling does take a decent amount of time to complete it in the correct way. So as you're working, just know that this is supposed to be a long process, and if you are finishing this very quickly, you probably didn't do a great job with having smooth transitions on your values. So it's really important that you take your time with this step. When you're working in that darkest section, so off to the left edge, you just barely want to be touching that scratch board with this scratching tool at all, because it will start to remove fairly decent sized pieces, so you want to make sure that you're just barely touching it. I noticed as I was working that the top of my sphere wasn't very rounded out, so I continued adding another layer just in that space to make sure that I didn't have any spaces that looked like they dipped in or weren't as round as the rest of the sphere. I also chose to fill in this space that was directly underneath my sphere just a little bit more because I thought it could use just a little bit more of that white filling it in. I also wanted to make sure I didn't leave it just plain black, because then you couldn't see where the edge of the circle started. So I did actually choose to fill in at least a few dots all the way up against the edge for the entire sphere. And this is what my sphere looked like when I was finished with it. So I just went through and added a few more highlights at the bottom just to show that little tiny highlight and blended it out into that black background. The next step is to surround the shadow area with just a light medium tone. And we're doing this to help it transition out, and we're still working with that stipple technique in the background as well. My goal for this shadow was first to surround that area that's going to be the shadow, and then I was slowly filling it in so that it was a smooth transition from that medium tone to the dark that was representing the shadow directly underneath the sphere. From here, I just went through and filled in a medium tone surrounding that shadow space. Then I chose to add in the horizon line, or just a line that represents a surface for that sphere to be sitting on. And I did that, and everything above that line can stay black, but what's underneath it needs to be filled in. I continued using that scribble technique to fill in the rest of that background space around my shadow. The final step is just to continue that medium tone with the scribble technique all the way around and making sure that your shadow has a nice smooth transition to the dark. To complete your second sphere, you can choose any of the other value techniques to fill it in using the same method that we worked with for the first sphere. Here's an example of one way that you could choose to complete your sphere, and I chose to work with hatching or lines, and I made sure that my lines all kind of rotated around that central highlight. But remember that there are many ways to complete this, so you can choose any of the other techniques to work with while finishing this second sphere. Thank you so much for watching this second episode of the Scratch Art Animal series. I hope it was helpful and that you learned a lot, so I will see you soon for the next episode. Thanks for watching!